On a Tuesday morning in March of 1983, Harold Briggs walked into Calvin Reese's yard on Depot Street in Harlan County, Kentucky, and told him his property was worth more to someone else than it would ever be worth to him. That's where this story starts. Not with the flood, not with the machines in the mud, not with the phone call Harold Briggs made 2 years later from a job site that was costing him $25,000 a day while the river kept rising and the ground kept swallowing his equipment. With a Tuesday morning in March, a man in a good suit standing in a gravel yard telling a 71-year-old wrecker operator that his time was up. Harold Briggs was 47 years old and he had been building things in Harlan County since 1968. Roads, bridges, commercial developments, the kind of projects that required county approval and county relationships, and a particular talent for making sure the right people understood that Harold Briggs's projects were good for everyone. He had that talent. He had cultivated it carefully over 15 years, and it had made him wealthy, and it had made him confident in ways that wealth and cultivation sometimes do that are not entirely healthy for a man. He drove a new Cadillac. He had an office in the nicest building in Harlan with his name on the door in brass letters. He wore suits to job sites, not because the work required it, but because he had decided early in his career that the way a man presented himself determined how seriously people took him, and he intended to be taken very seriously. His expansion plan for the south end of Harlan was the largest project he had ever attempted. 40 acres of commercial development along the Cumberland River, new road access, a small industrial park, the kind of investment that would take 5 years and change the character of that part of town permanently. He had the financing. He had the county relationships. He had the permits moving through the right channels. What he had in the middle of his plan was Calvin Reese's yard on Depot Street. Let me tell you about Calvin Reese. Because to understand what happened in the winter of 1985, you have to understand the man Harold Briggs decided to push. Calvin was 71 years old in 1983. He had been born in Harlan County, had grown up in Harlan County, and with the exception of 2 years in the Army between 1932 and 1934, had spent his entire life within 20 miles of the spot where his yard now sat. His father, Denton Reese, had run a livery stable on Depot Street from 1908 until horses stopped being the primary means of moving things in Harlan County, at which point Denton had sold the horses and bought a truck and started moving things with that instead. Calvin had grown up in his father's operation, the way boys grew up in family businesses in that era, not as a child who helped out occasionally, but as a working member of the enterprise from the time he was old enough to be useful. He had learned to drive before he could see over the steering wheel. He had learned to work on engines before he could name all their parts. By the time he was 16, he could rebuild a transmission, and by the time he was 20, he had done things with broken machinery that the men around him considered somewhere between skill and witchcraft. Denton died in 1951 and left Calvin the yard and the truck and a set of tools that were better maintained than anything else Denton owned. Calvin had been running the operation since then. 32 years by the time Harold Briggs walked through his gate in March of 1983. The yard was not impressive to look at. A gravel lot with good drainage that Calvin had installed himself in 1962. A 2-bay garage with a metal roof that had been replaced once, in 1971, when a winter ice load collapsed the original. A small office attached to the garage with a wood stove and a telephone and a metal desk that had been his father's. And in the yard, 2 trucks. The first was a 1961 Ford that Calvin used for standard road calls. Light duty, reliable, nothing special. The second was a 1948 Mack that Calvin had purchased in 1955 for $1,200 and had been modifying ever since. The Mack was the reason Harold Briggs's plan was going to fail, but neither of them knew that yet. Harold's offer was direct. He wanted the Depot Street property. He was prepared to pay fair market value, which his appraiser had set at $34,000, which Harold considered generous given what the property was and what it looked like. Calvin listened to the offer from behind his metal desk. Then he said no. Harold had expected negotiation. He had prepared for negotiation. He had a number in his head that was higher than $34,000, and he had intended to arrive at it through the normal process of a man asking for more and another man eventually conceding the point. Calvin's no was not a negotiating position. It was an answer. Harold explained the development plan. He explained what the area would look like in 5 years. He explained that a wrecker yard on Depot Street was not going to fit into the vision for the new South End, and that Calvin would do better to sell now at a fair price, while the selling was good. Calvin looked at him. "I'm not selling," Calvin said. Harold drove back to his office and called his attorney. What followed was 2 years of pressure applied through every channel Harold Briggs had access to, which were considerable. The county zoning office received a complaint about Reese Recovery's compliance with current commercial operation codes. An inspector came out. Calvin's operation was found to be in compliance. Harold's attorney filed a second complaint citing different codes. A second inspector came. Calvin was found to be in compliance again. The county road department received a request to study whether Depot Street's designation as a through road was appropriate given current traffic patterns. The study was commissioned. It found that Depot Street's current designation was appropriate. A representative from the State Environmental Office appeared at Calvin's gate one morning to discuss concerns about fluid storage and disposal at the property. Calvin showed him the storage tanks, the disposal records going back to 1962, and the containment measures he had installed without being required to. The representative left without filing a report. Harold increased the offer to $48,000. Calvin said no. Harold's attorney sent a letter suggesting that the property's value would decline significantly as the surrounding development proceeded, and that Calvin would regret not taking the current offer. Calvin did not respond to the letter. Harold went to 3 members of the county commission individually and explained his development plan and the role the Depot Street property played in it. 2 of them listened politely and did nothing. One of them told Harold privately that Calvin Reese had been in Harlan County longer than Harold's development company, and that there were limits to how far the county was prepared to go on a private property matter. Harold did not take this well. He went back to Calvin one more time, in November of 1984, and sat across the metal desk in the small office with the wood stove, and said what he had been building toward for 20 months. "I'm going to develop that land whether you sell to me or not," Harold said. "I can root around your property. It'll cost me more and it'll take longer, but I'll do it. And when I'm done, this yard is going to be surrounded on 3 sides by commercial development, and the 4th side is going to be the river, and you're going to be sitting here in the middle of something you don't belong in anymore." Calvin looked at him across the desk. Then he looked at the wood stove. "That river floods," Calvin said. "You know that." Harold said he had engineers who had addressed the flood risk in the development plan. Calvin nodded slowly. "All right," he said. Harold waited for more. That was all Calvin said. Harold stood up and left and went back to his Cadillac and drove to his office and told his project manager to proceed with the modified routing that went around the Reese property. He was going to build his development. It was going to cost him more and take longer, and Calvin Reese was going to end up exactly where Harold had said he would end up, surrounded and irrelevant. That was November of 1984. In February of 1985, the Cumberland River flooded. Let me tell you about the flood, because the flood is where Harold Briggs's plan met something that had not been included in the engineering study. The winter of 1984 to 1985 was the kind of winter that Harlan County people of a certain age still reference as a marker. Cold came early and stayed. Snow came in December and did not leave. In February, a warm front pushed through and melted 2 months of accumulated snowpack in 4 days, while rain fell on top of the melt, and the Cumberland River, which had been running low under ice, came up 8 feet in 48 hours. Harold's job site on the south end was a foundation project. 12,000 square feet of commercial building, concrete footings poured in the fall, steel going up through the winter. The site sat 40 yards from the river on ground that the engineering study had determined was above the 100-year flood plain. The engineering study had been correct about the 100-year flood plain. The winter of 1985 produced a 114-year flood. The river came up over the bank on a Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, the job site had 2 feet of standing water. By Thursday afternoon, it had 4 feet, and the ground beneath the construction equipment was no longer behaving like ground. The clay subsoil, saturated beyond any condition the site engineers had modeled, had lost its load-bearing capacity in the areas closest to the river. Harold's 2 largest excavators, a Caterpillar 235 and a John Deere 690, both of which had been operating on the site through the winter, settled into the softened ground on Thursday afternoon within 2 hours of each other. The 235 went into its tracks. The 690 went deeper, the cab partially submerged before the mud stopped it. Harold called his equipment company in Lexington. They said the ground conditions made it impossible to get a recovery rig onto the site. Any heavy vehicle that drove onto that saturated clay was going to sink the same way the excavators had. Harold called a crane company in Knoxville. They said a crane set up on the road would not have the reach to access the equipment from a safe position. Harold called a salvage company out of Middlesboro. They came out, looked at the site from the road, and said they would need to wait for the water to recede and the ground to firm up before they could attempt anything. How long? Harold asked. 3 weeks minimum, the Middlesboro man said, maybe 4. Harold did the math. His project was already 3 weeks behind from the flood damage. Another 3 to 4 weeks waiting for recovery, then the recovery itself, then assessment of equipment damage, then resuming construction. He was looking at 2 months of delay minimum. At the carrying costs of his financing, the labor he was paying to stand down, the contract penalties he was facing with his first commercial tenant, 2 months was going to cost him somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000. He stood on the road above his flooded job site on a Thursday evening in February of 1985 and looked at his equipment in the mud and felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt out of options. That night he drove back to his office. He sat at his desk. He looked at the phone. He thought about who he had not called. Then he drove to Depot Street. Calvin's yard was lit. Not brightly, the way a busy operation runs at night, but the way a yard stays lit when the man who runs it doesn't entirely sleep during a flood. A single light over the garage door, the wood stove chimney putting out smoke. Harold parked his Cadillac on the street and walked through the gate. Calvin was in the garage. He was working on something at the bench, the kind of work that keeps hands busy while a mind works through a problem. He looked up when Harold came in. He did not look surprised. He did not look satisfied. He just looked at Harold the way a man looks at someone he has been expecting for a while. "I need your help," Harold said. He had practiced other ways of saying it on the drive over, other framings, more indirect approaches, but standing in Calvin Reese's garage with the wood stove going and the flood still up and 2 excavators in the mud and $400,000 on the line, the indirect approaches had not seemed adequate. Calvin set down what he was working on. "Sit down," he said. There was one other chair in the garage besides the stool Calvin used at the bench. It was a wooden chair with a broken spindle in the back that had been repaired with a bolt and a washer. Harold sat in it. Calvin poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. He set one in front of Harold. He sat back on his stool. "Tell me what you have," Calvin said. Harold told him. The 2 excavators, the ground conditions, the water level, what the recovery companies had said, what the crane company had said, what the Middlesboro salvage crew had said. Calvin listened without interrupting. When Harold finished, Calvin was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the garage wall where a set of drawings were pinned, hand-drawn, the kind of working drawings a man makes for himself, not for anyone else. "That river," Calvin said, "I tried to tell you." "I know," Harold said. Calvin drank his coffee. "I'm not asking you to forget the last 2 years," Harold said. "I'm asking you if you can help me get those machines out." Calvin looked at him. "I know you can do it," Harold said. "I don't know how, but I know you can." Calvin was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Come back at 6 in the morning. Wear boots you don't care about." Now let me tell you about the Mac. Because the Mac is the reason Calvin could do what nobody else could, and you need to understand the machine before you can understand what happened the next morning. The 1948 Mac B series that Calvin had bought in 1955 was not, by 1985, what it had been when he bought it. Not in the way that things wear down and become less. In the way that things are worked on by a man who understands them and become more. Calvin had been modifying the Mac for 30 years. Not all at once. Not according to a plan he had drawn up in advance. According to the problems he had encountered and the solutions he had worked out, one job at a time, over 3 decades of working the rivers and the hollows and the back roads of Harlan County in conditions that no recovery manual had been written to address. The most significant modification was the system he had built for working in and around water. Harlan County sits in the Cumberland River watershed. The river floods. The creeks flood. Equipment goes into water in Harlan County the way equipment goes into ditches in flat country, regularly and without much warning, and getting it out requires dealing with saturated ground, which means you cannot always drive a recovery rig to where the problem is. Calvin had figured this out in 1963 when he had been called to recover a logging truck that had gone into a creek off a hollow road, and found that every approach to the site turned to muck under his truck's weight before he could get close enough to work. He had stood on solid ground 30 feet from the truck and thought about the problem for 2 hours, and then driven home and spent a month building something in his garage. What he built was a floating anchor system. The concept was simple. If you cannot drive to the problem because the ground will not support your weight, you do not drive to the problem. You float to it. Or more precisely, you float your anchor point to it and work from solid ground through the floating system. Calvin had built 3 anchored pontoons from steel drums and angle iron, each one capable of supporting 600 pounds of equipment on the water's surface. Each pontoon had a series of attachment points for running chain or cable in multiple directions. The pontoons could be connected to each other to form a larger platform or deployed independently as separate anchor points. The system allowed Calvin to position anchor points in the water, anchor those points to fixed objects like bridge pilings or bedrock outcroppings using underwater chain, and then run pulling lines from solid ground through the floating anchor points to whatever needed to be moved. It was not elegant. It was not fast. It required knowing how to read water, how to find anchor points below the surface, and how to calculate the angles and loads across a system that was moving, however slightly, with the current. Calvin had used it 11 times in 22 years. It had worked 11 times. Nobody outside of Harlan County knew it existed. Nobody inside Harlan County, except his 2 regular customers, had ever seen it in operation. It was not the kind of thing you advertised because it was not the kind of thing people knew to ask for. Harold Briggs had not known to ask for it. He had just known that Calvin Reese was the only man who might be able to help him. He had been right about that. 6 in the morning, Thursday, February 21st, 1985. Harold arrived at Calvin's yard in his Cadillac, wearing rubber boots he had bought at the farm supply store the previous evening. Calvin was already in the yard. The Mack was running, exhaust curling in the cold morning air. Behind the Mack on a trailer were the 3 pontoons and a collection of chain, cable, shackles, and equipment that Harold could not immediately identify. Calvin's 2 employees, a man named Pete who had worked for Calvin since 1969, and a younger man named Darnell who had been there for 6 years, were loading the last of the equipment onto the trailer. Harold looked at the pontoons. "What are those?" he said. Calvin looked at them. "How I get to where I can't drive," he said. He climbed into the Mack and put it in gear. Harold followed in his Cadillac. The job site in the early morning light looked worse than it had the evening before. The water had receded slightly overnight, maybe 6 inches, but the ground between the road and the river was still saturated, and the excavators were still in it. The Caterpillar 235 visible to its upper tracks, the John Deere 690 with its cab barely clear of the standing water. Harold's project manager, a man named Strickland who had been running Harold's jobs for 8 years, was already there. He looked at the Mack. He looked at the pontoons on the trailer. He looked at Calvin, who was 71 years old and wearing the same work coat he wore every day. He looked at Harold. Harold looked at the job site. "Let him work," Harold said. Calvin walked the road above the site for 20 minutes before he did anything else. He walked it the way Virgil Cook had walked a river bank, the way Walter Brennan had walked a swamp, the way men walk when they are reading something that is written in the ground and the water rather than on paper. He looked at where the current was moving and where it was still. He looked at the angle between the road and each excavator. He looked at the bridge piling 40 yards upstream that was bedrock anchored and had been there since 1938. Then he went back to the trailer and began unloading pontoons. Strickland watched him work. After a few minutes, he walked over to where Harold was standing. "What is he doing?" Strickland said. Harold watched Calvin and Pete carry the first pontoon to the water's edge. "I don't entirely know," Harold said, "but don't say anything." It took Calvin an hour and 40 minutes to set up the system, not because he was slow, because setting it up correctly required patience and precision that could not be rushed without compromising the result. He put the first pontoon in the water and walked it upstream along the flooded bank, wading in water up to his thighs in February, until he reached the bridge piling. He anchored the pontoon to the piling with chain, running the chain around the concrete base and back-hooking it, then tested the anchor by loading it from 2 directions. He put the second pontoon in the water and connected it to the first with a length of chain, positioning it at an angle that created a redirect point for the pulling line. He anchored the second pontoon's position with a ground stake driven into a small island of solid ground that emerged from the flood water 15 feet from the near edge of the saturated zone. He ran chain from the Mack's drum on solid ground, through the second pontoon's redirect block, through the first pontoon's redirect block, across the remaining water to the submerged Caterpillar 235. He went into the water to attach the chain to the excavator, chest deep. February water in Harlan County, Kentucky. He did not acknowledge this. He hooked the chain to the Caterpillar's main frame at the rear, the heaviest structural connection point, using a grab hook that had been on that Mack since Calvin bought it. Then he walked back to solid ground, feeding chain as he came. Harold Briggs had not moved from the road. He had watched the entire setup in silence. Strickland had stopped asking questions after the first pontoon went in. Calvin climbed into the Mack. He engaged the PTO. The drum began to turn. The chain ran from the drum across the road edge, down to the second pontoon, redirected across the water to the first pontoon, redirected again at a different angle, and then ran straight to the Caterpillar's rear frame. The two redirect points meant the pull was coming from an angle that no rig positioned on the road could have achieved directly. The chain was pulling the excavator not straight toward the road, which would have dragged it sideways through the mud, but at a diagonal that aligned with the path of least resistance through the saturated clay. The pontoons moved slightly in the current as the chain loaded. The anchors held. The Mac's engine dropped its note. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened on the surface of the water. Then the mud around the Caterpillar's tracks shifted. Not much. A disturbance in the standing water above the tracks, a small upwelling of sediment that meant something below the surface had moved. Harold saw it from the road. He said nothing. The drum turned. The chain pulled. The engine held its note at the bottom of its range, the working note, the note that meant everything the machine had was going into the drum. The Caterpillar moved. 1 foot, 2 feet, diagonal through the mud, following the line the chain was drawing for it, not fighting the saturated clay but moving with the angle Calvin had calculated. The tracks emerged from the deepest mud and found slightly firmer material closer to the road. 5 feet, 10 feet. Strickland made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Harold did not make any sound at all. 20 feet. The Caterpillar's tracks were out of the water now, on the saturated margin of the site, still soft but bearing weight. Calvin kept the drum turning, kept pulling, walked the machine another 30 feet until it was on the road itself, solid ground, out of the mud and the water and the saturated clay that had swallowed it. He disengaged the PTO. He sat in the Mac for a moment. Then he got out and began repositioning the pontoons for the second excavator. The John Deere 690 took longer because it was deeper and the angle was more complex. Calvin repositioned the second pontoon twice before he was satisfied with the redirect angle. He went into the water again to set the attachment point, deeper this time, the water at his chin at the lowest point of the approach. He was 71 years old. It was February. The water was the temperature of February water in Kentucky. He did not acknowledge this either. The 690 came out in 45 minutes once the chain was set. The same method, the same patience, the drum turning at the same deliberate pace, the chain loading link by link, the pontoons redirecting the pull to the angle that worked. By 11 in the morning, both excavators were on the road. Calvin began breaking down the pontoon system. Harold Briggs stood on the road and watched him work. He had been standing in approximately the same spot for 5 hours. His rubber boots were muddy. His good coat was damp from the mist off the river. Strickland had gone to his truck to make phone calls. Pete and Darnell were helping Calvin load the pontoons. Harold walked over to where Calvin was coiling chain. "Calvin," he said. Calvin looked up. "Name your price," Harold said. Calvin looked at the chain in his hands. "What did the Middlesboro company quote you to wait 3 weeks and try?" Calvin asked. Harold told him. "Half that," Calvin said. "I was here 5 hours, not 3 weeks." Harold shook his head. "That's not right. You should charge more than that." Calvin picked up the next length of chain. "That's what I charge," he said. Harold was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about your yard," Harold said. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Calvin did not stop coiling chain. "Yes," he said, "you were." That was all he said, not with bitterness, not with satisfaction, the way a man states a thing that is true and does not require elaboration. Harold took out his checkbook. He paid the invoice that afternoon. Full amount, not the half Calvin had offered. He included a letter with the check. The letter said that Briggs Development would not be pursuing any further action regarding the Depot Street property. It said that Harold had withdrawn the zoning complaints and the code inquiries. It said that if Calvin ever needed anything from Briggs' development, he should call directly. Calvin read the letter. He put it in the drawer with his other paperwork. He called Harold's office the next morning and left a message with the secretary saying the letter was received and the matter was settled as far as he was concerned. He did not make more of it than that. Word moved through Harlan County the way word moves in places where people pay attention. At the hardware store, at the diner on Main Street, at the county road department, at the equipment dealer out on the highway. The story changed a little with each telling. The excavators got bigger, the water got deeper, Calvin got older, but the core of it stayed true. Harold Briggs spent 2 years trying to push Calvin Reese out of Harlan County. Then he spent 5 hours watching Calvin pull his equipment out of the Cumberland River with a system nobody else had and a truck nobody else understood. Calvin Reese ran his yard on Depot Street until 1993. He was 81 years old that year, and his hands had lost enough of their sensitivity that he didn't trust himself in cold water anymore, which was the work that mattered most. He sat down with his grandson, a 26-year-old named James who had been working the yard since he was old enough to be useful, and told him the yard was his. James had grown up in that yard the way Calvin had grown up in his father's yard. He had handed chain on jobs when he was 9 years old. He had learned the pontoon system by helping Calvin deploy it. He had been in the water with Calvin on 2 jobs before Calvin trusted him to run the system alone. He kept the yard, he kept the Mack. He rebuilt the Mack's engine in 1996, the same displacement, the same configuration, because James believed you maintained things to what they were, not to something else. He updated the pontoons in 2001, replacing the steel drums with modern closed-cell foam billets that were lighter and more buoyant, but keeping the same attachment geometry Calvin had designed in 1963. Harold Briggs's development on the south end of Harlan was completed in 1987, 2 years behind schedule. It was smaller than originally planned, the routing around the Depot Street property having required design compromises that reduced the total footprint. Harold never publicly discussed the February 1985 recovery, but he never again approached Calvin or James about the property. When Harold died in 2004, his son found a file in Harold's office desk. The file contained the original offer letter to Calvin Reese, the attorney correspondence, the zoning complaints, and the engineering study that had concluded the South End development site was above the 100-year flood plain. Behind all of it was a handwritten note in Harold's handwriting. The note said one thing. "He told me the river floods. I should have listened." Calvin Reese died in 1998 at the age of 86. His funeral was held at the First Baptist Church in Harlan, and the building was full. Men came who had called Calvin from situations that no one else could address. County road workers, farmers, contractors, a few men from the state highway department who had worked with Calvin on flood recovery jobs going back to the 1960s. James stood at the door of the church and shook hands for an hour before the service started. Harold Briggs's son came. Harold had been in poor health and had not made the drive, but he had called James the evening before. "Your grandfather, Harold Jr., said at the door, 'My father talked about him, not often, but he talked about him.'" James nodded. Harold Jr. shook his hand and went inside. The yard on Depot Street is still there. James Reese runs it. He has a newer truck for the daily work, a modern hydraulic unit that handles the standard calls. But the 1948 Mack is in the back of the garage under a canvas tarp that James pulls off once a month to start the engine. The pontoons are on a rack in the corner of the second bay, updated once in 2001, but the same system Calvin built in 1963, the same geometry, the same principle. James has deployed the system 4 times since Calvin retired. Each time the circumstances were different. Each time the result was the same. People who come to the yard sometimes see the Mack under the tarp and ask about it. James tells them it's the truck that taught him everything he knows. They ask what it taught him. He thinks about his grandfather wading into the Cumberland River in February with chain over his shoulder, and a 71-year-old body that knew what cold water felt like and went in anyway because the job needed doing. It taught me, James says, that the river doesn't care how much your equipment cost. He pulls the tarp back down. The Mack sits in the dark. The drum still has chain on it. The chain is newer than the drum. The drum is original. And somewhere in a desk drawer in an office in Harlan, there is a note in a dead man's handwriting that says the same thing Calvin said in November of 1984, and Harold Briggs did not hear until February of 1985, when the river said it for him. The river floods. It always floods. The only question is whether the man you pushed out of the way is still willing to come when you call. Calvin Reese was. That is the only reason Harold Briggs's story didn't end in that mud. And that is the only reason this story is still worth telling.